a lot of the benefits are realized in Kubernetes when you're sharing those across users, teams, departments, cost centers, applications, etc. Costs are by and large a black box, right? Because if you say you spent $1 million last month, but you can't say who spent it, then like how do you manage that efficiently? How do you like build a culture of just awareness and transparency, etc.? You really can't.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 163. What is Kubecost? Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farson. Victor, you have an unlimited budget, right?
For what I spend, which is small amounts, 3 digits a month, yes, I have unlimited. I think Google and Sivo and everybody's giving me free credits more than I can spend, so yes, it's close to unlimited.
I think somebody's probably going to be emailing us like, hey, give me some of those credits.
Then it's not going to be unlimited anymore.
That my person might be me. So you might be asking why we're talking about costs. Today we've got on a guest with us. We have Webb Brown on from Kubecost. Did I say that right?
You did. Nailed it.
Because I was going to say Kubecost, but as we were preparing, I heard you say Kubecost. And I feel like, that doesn't seem natural.
We are super accepting of all interpretations, including Kubecost and others. But
okay,
I think
I didn't even think of that one, so that's great. That's good. So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit more and just sort of give a high-level overview of what Kubecost is?
Yeah. First, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to talk about what is very much a passion area for me. And I think for a lot of, users that we meet, the name kind of gives it away, right from the beginning, and that in the sense that it's cost monitoring, real-time cost monitoring and cost management for Kubernetes-based environments. Kubecost started as an open source project in early 2019. That was after my co-founder and I had been at Google for a long time, thinking about different aspects of infrastructure monitoring related to performance, health, and cost, and really the intersection of all those really interesting areas. Because our perspective is they are oftentimes deeply related in the sense of you can't reduce your infrastructure spend without thinking about the potential impact it may have on performance, uptime, etc. That's quick background, and I'm one of the co-creators and have a product management experience background from my time at Google, and love really digging into these problems and dynamic Kubernetes environments.
The curious part to me is when you say cost in Kubernetes, what that really means, because Kubernetes, what is Kubernetes? Nodes, load balancers, disk drives, networking, everything.
Totally. Yeah, it's a great point. We think about cost in like 3, real buckets, and really the third is a derivation of the first and second. So we talk about costs from an in-cluster standpoint. So it's all of these Kubernetes native or, Kubernetes like primitive concepts. So like a node, a PV and a PVC, and like a load balancer, everything that Kubernetes has a fundamental understanding of. And then outside of cluster are all these external costs, which are very relevant to most teams. And that could be a storage bucket, a database, or like a data warehouse, like a lot of different options. And to have the complete picture, you need to think about both. You need to think about like, your entire footprint of spend. And then the third category is, it's really common where you're sharing some of these resources. That could be as simple as like sharing the kube system namespace, across all of your, Kubernetes tenants or, workloads, or sharing some external cloud database, for example. So it's really the combination of all three of those that, from our perspective, is required to have a complete picture of your broader Kubernetes footprint, because it's pretty rare where teams are just, like you said, only nodes or only nodes and disk, etc.
So it's kind of almost, at least I had a feeling when I used it, that it's almost misleading to call it Kubecost, to be honest, because it's really not, I see it more like something that happens to run in Kubernetes. And yes, very much focused on the resources in Kubernetes, but you just mentioned databases, right? I'm guessing that you were referring to something like RDS in AWS and not Postgres running in a Kubernetes cluster.
Exactly.
So it's more like an engine for getting costs than costs limited to Kubernetes alone, right?
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. The way we talk about it is basically everything we do, like Kubernetes is at the center of like, the universe. So like when we think about an application or a tenant, we're thinking about, Kubernetes-based workloads. Yes, those workloads consume other resources, but generally we have found that given the deep focus on Kubernetes, if a team's not running Kubernetes, Kubecost probably isn't a good fit today. I do think we may want to think about changing the name if that, fully changes. But yeah, it's like everything we do kind of starts with, we think about like, concentric circles even, but like Kubernetes at the center. There may be CRDs that are pulling in other resources that aren't Kubernetes primitives. And there may be fully external cloud, resources, just like you mentioned, like an RDS or something else.
The part I really liked wasn't that much the cost itself. I can see that I'm spending X amount of money on all my infrastructure, and this is how much it goes to subnets, and this is how much it goes to this or that. But more like that ability to be able to pinpoint to different teams and individuals, right? Which I feel is kind of a thing that is missing very often from the costs. How am I going to charge and how am I going to improve something if I cannot actually figure out who is spending the money?
Totally.
Way, right?
Yeah, that was really the biggest pain point we saw when we started the Kubecost project. And I would go even further and say that like for a lot of teams, costs in that regard are still a black box, right? Like, what you spend per cluster, maybe even per individual node, disk, etc. But a lot of the benefits are realized in Kubernetes when you're sharing those across, users, teams, departments, cost centers, applications, etc. So that ability to like appropriately allocate costs are by and large a black box, right? Because if you say you spent $1 million last month, but you can't say who spent it, then like how do you manage that efficiently? How do you like build a culture of just awareness and transparency, etc.? You really can't. So it's like, it's unsurprising when we start working with a lot of teams when they don't have that visibility that it's really hard to be efficient, right? Like it is very common for us we talk about this notion of cost efficiency, which is essentially like every dollar you're spending, how much of that are you actually utilizing at the end of the day? Sometimes we see teams in single digit cost efficiency ranges, like 8%. So truly, out of $100,000, they're spending, they're consuming or utilizing less than 10% of it sometimes. And again, the pattern we see often without the visibility, without the ability to, just like you said, allocate or segment, it's really hard to like optimize that in a meaningful way.
Or even be motivated to optimize, right? Why would I, ignoring the cost now completely, right? Why would I optimize something, let's say reduce the number of nodes remove those that I don't need if it doesn't hurt me at all.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Not my problem.
Yeah, and I come from first an engineering background. Before I was a product manager, and as an engineer, you've got a lot of things to think about, right? And like cost often isn't number one. It's more about like how do you build a great feature, how do you make it secure, reliable, etc. What we found there is just to the extent that you can make that really easy to have just that general awareness, right? Whether it's as part of your CI/CD pipeline, whether it's part of like a weekly, or monthly update, whether it's part of your like Grafana dashboard, just something to have general awareness, to have a sense of, does this application cost me, $5,000 a month or $500,000, right? Because you're right, without having that, even some degree of accuracy, it's really hard to invest, cycles or resources to optimize things that you don't really know can't quantify the benefits of.
Have you noticed any trends or something kind of, by trends, I mean like, I don't know, average engineer who uses Google tends to be more cost efficient than AWS. I mean, I'm throwing random things. Are there any patterns you've seen so far?
Yeah, a number. I think if you look, and CNCF had a really interesting survey from last summer where approximately 2/3 of teams reported that costs were still a black box to them. I think you're starting to see more teams move past that phase and now starting to think about, okay, how do I optimize my infrastructure and manage it in a way that like has the right balance between cost, performance, etc. So that feels like a big step forward in our ecosystem. Second is some of the numbers that we're seeing are staggering and are amazing in the sense of like the scale of which Kubernetes is being adopted, right? And so we're now monitoring billions and billions of dollars, and it's hard to even fathom that when we launched the like project 3 years ago. So just scale is like trending up in a really big way. But I would say like 3 is what I kind of alluded to earlier, is like it is not uncommon for us to start working with teams when they're in a cost efficiency level of sometimes single digits and other times like 20% range. And that, from we have seen, is like independent of environment. That is more a function of, we see that when they don't yet have that visibility or any kind of governance or controls in place. And that really hasn't changed, too much from when we first start engaging teams over the last, call it, 18 months to 2 years.
I know you mentioned just getting things shipped and making sure you've got a product and going, but I can't see how a company can justify an 8% utilization. Any other real company in life would be under if they were 8% utilized.
Yeah, I think it's a function of two things. One is, it's really common for teams just don't know, right? When we first, and it's almost just kind of said like, well, this is our bill, and so that's kind of the way life is. But I also think it's a function of that scale point, right? Where if you're say only for big enterprises, it's a small number. For individuals, it may be a large number. But like if you're spending $1,000 a month or $10,000 a month, it may be okay, or maybe even not worth the team's time yet to like dig in there a little bit. What we if there's a pattern we see, it's like once you cross the like $100,000 a month range, that it starts to be like, okay, this is probably, again, we may not have perfect accuracy, but like we've seen enough to know that there's probably real gains from us just even spending a little bit of time there.
What are those typical first efficiencies that you see once people have started using Kubecost?
So it definitely varies, but there's for sure some common patterns. And to get perspective, when you can Helm install Kubecost in minutes. It's fully like deployed in your environment. Everything in Kubecost, community version and, our paid versions are built on top of the like open core Kubecost project. Once it's deployed, we would, Kubecost would generate up to, I believe today, 16 different insights around optimizations or savings. Some of the big ones can often be one, at scale, you may have a bunch of workloads that are deployed in your environment that are consuming meaningful costs, and you've deprecated that functionality, or you thought you deleted and really someone rotated teams and you forgot to clean it up. So we talk about it as being like abandoned workloads, and we've seen that be hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, which teams find that like right away when you start looking again like accurate cost attribution, utilization, etc. So that's one. Second would be once you start looking at the efficiency of individual applications and if they're consuming the right amount of resources given the kind of performance to cost trade-offs that those applications have. And by that, I mean like when you're in say a dev or a staging environment, you may be comfortable with applications having a little bit less CPU, knowing that there may be some risk they'd be throttled if there was bursty, like behavior. Whereas when you're in an HA or prod environment, you may be willing to spend more to avoid that risk, right? Because response times, avoiding timeouts like really matters. So that would be, a common second one, which is just, like optimizing containers themselves. And then as a result of that, oftentimes teams can realize that like either entire clusters are really inefficient or like segments of that cluster, whether it's like a certain, node pool that maybe has taints and tolerations applied to it or something else can then be, optimized. And obviously that is the piece that's like going to drive the big, cost saver is once you like change the underlying infrastructure. So I would say those are, first three. And then, another common one, I think this can even be just a big paradigm shift, whereas the others can be, really quick wins, is like moving into auto scaling environments and really kind of understanding the relationship between cost and performance, scale up, scale down, all that good stuff. And that could be, cluster autoscaler combined with, one of the pod level or controller level autoscalers.
What about labor cost? Are you able to like matrix jack people in and also factor that in?
It's a great question. And it's definitely something that you have to think about, right? Because teams are busy, right? Like we don't have unlimited time and we all have kind of opportunity cost, if you will. So yeah, there's a number of ways that is accounted for. One is, and we see it more with on-prem infrastructure. So with Kubecost, you can deploy it in not only any of the like major 3 cloud providers, but it can be deployed in a Kubernetes cluster, really running anywhere, including on-prem or air-gapped. And when you deploy on-prem, typically part of calculating the like, essentially like amortized or, operating cost of the like assets in your infrastructure would be building like a depreciation schedule, incorporating oftentimes like your IT, your infrastructure, DevOps team's time, et cetera. So truly it would be like, baked into the actual cost of the infrastructure. Today, it's still a little bit more of an art. We give teams guidance on if they're looking at an optimization is here's the very accurate cost impact of that, but the cost in terms of time, being to realize it can be complex. It can depend on your organizational structure and your IAM policies, for example, or, just permissioning throughout your, engineering teams. And so that's typically, we will often work with teams, whether it's just like in the community or more when we do sell paid like Kubecost, to actually help them think through kind of some of those trade-offs and expected costs to actually going in and enabling something like auto scaling, for example.
You bring up an interesting point there about on-premise versus cloud. It seems like the typical cost models from on-prem is typically OpEx versus cloud being CapEx. Did I say that backwards? I said it backwards. Usually on-prem is CapEx and cloud is OpEx. How does that really factor in? Because I think about on-prem, it's like, okay, well, I had to go and rack and stack all these things. Whereas cloud, if I'm at least halfway decent, I'm probably managing how much I'm actually running. I mean, ignoring the abandoned and stuff like that. I mean, if I'm doing something new, I'm probably not over provisioning, at least not to the scale of what I would do with an on-premise solution.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's two parts to it for the on-prem piece. First is actually trying to get to an apples to apples comparison. So like, talking about, again, kind of the upfront cost and or, relative discounts and labor costs, and then expected useful lives and, truly a depreciation schedule to truly say that like, 1 hour of a virtual CPU core on this machine costs your company X, right? 1 memory GB hour on this other machine in this other region costs Y. So that allows you to then say, if you look at like, we say kind of like this marginal decision of if you have a choice to run a workload, in a cloud environment versus, on your on-prem environment, you should make the optimal decision at that time. And that's a function of not just costs, but also, other things like, performance and, feature functionality, et cetera. So that's one thing that we believe is really important, is to be able to make those comparisons. A lot of the teams, so to get perspective, about 20% of teams running Kubecost that we've worked with are on-prem or have on-prem footprint. A lot of them also have cloud environments where they're thinking about not necessarily arbitrage, but they're thinking about the like relative cost across those. So that's the big part one, is making that operating cost comparison. But then the part two is, yes, if you're continuing to invest in that on-prem data center, is how do you forecast and estimate CapEx needs going forward, given the consumption patterns and efficiency of the workloads that you've been running over some measured window. And so Kubecost would allow you to look at different time periods, like aggregate things based on application, team, department, product, etc.
Can you predict in some way how much it would cost to move from on-prem to cloud? I bet it's at least one person so far asked you this question before me. I cannot be the first one, right?
Yeah, I think in terms of users that I've talked to about, I think we may get into double digits. So we absolutely have the data to do that. We've been discussing whether we can help users in that regard. The one observation we've had as a team is that transition is, yes, oftentimes cost can be a real driver, but given the kind of just like the median enterprise, or like the enterprise that we typically work with, typically that's like a much more complex decision than just cost, right? Sometimes it's only cost, but a lot of times it's really thinking through, again, like the full matrix of functionality and security and compliance constraints. Like, is a really complex decision. So we've worked with a number of teams to like think through it. Again, we have all the raw inputs to like provide the relative cost comparison. Be interesting to see if we can do something there to help.
So you were just talking about on-prem to provider. What about provider to provider? Let's say I'm on AWS and I'm considering making a move to Google. Can I find that out, or at least know that, okay, if you were to make that move, it's going to be raw numbers 3 years for you to make it back?
Yeah. We've thought about that very similarly, which is, we have the APIs, we have the data. Oftentimes our experience has been like those transitions are also, again, cost is one part of the equation, but it's not always, the entire equation. And so I suspect we would, if we were going to do something there, we'd probably do both around the same time. Because I do think it's interesting, but again, just would want to make sure that we are helping teams recognize that cost can be really important, but it's also oftentimes around the value and the other constraints when you're thinking about full provider or environment shifts.
Yeah, when I asked about on-prem to provider, I was not thinking that much about cost in terms of value or savings, but more like elevating fear. Kind of, yes, I understand that I should be in AWS, but what if it happens that I need to pay 2 million next month or something like that?
I think most of the providers in our ecosystem acknowledge that a little healthy competition is a good thing. But really, like, what we have found is that most teams have a really big opportunity to optimizing, improving, again, not only just costs, but like costs relative to performance and reliability in their current environment. And oftentimes, not only are those like the bigger wins, again, sometimes that's up to like 80 or 90% of spend. We've truly seen at that level, again, without like any, performance degradation or like, compromises. And oftentimes those are much lower lift as well, right? Like if you're not a massive enterprise with a bunch of teams, like moving to a new cloud provider for most is a major engineering effort, not to say for all.
So what does AWS, Azure, and Google folks think of you then? Kind of like you're telling people to spend less.
Well, we've had amazing experience working with the providers. Oftentimes, what the case is like, again, teams are missing that visibility, and when you're missing visibility as like a CIO, CTO or CFO, it's kind of hard to say, let's invest all of our resources in that environment if you truly don't know where those dollars are going. Our belief and our experience has shown that it's actually like a gating friction point, that when teams are comfortable, they feel like they have the governance or guardrails in place, they'll actually bet more there over time. In the short term, they may spend less, but in the long term, they're going to be comfortable making a really big bet on that provider, that environment, et cetera. And then I would just kind of highlight that cost is a really important part of what we do. It's in our name, but again, like it's deeply intertwined with performance, right? When we talk about changing the amount of resources or the location of those resources or how and when you auto scale, those can have massive impacts on reliability and all these really important core infrastructure metrics.
Let's talk through one of those specific examples. You're talking about location. I'm assuming you don't want to be running in East 1, you really want to be running in East 2. Or instead of running an extra large, you really want to run a double X based on how the workloads are going. Is that the kind of recommendations I can get?
Yeah, that'd be two examples of recommendations there. And I think it's important to highlight that is not just kind of general right sizing of like, EU West is, cheaper than, this like AZ or, this region I'm in, but like doing that in a very Kubernetes specific way. And also one that is, tailored to your environment. So one example would be, generally, what you pointed out is like, as you have more workloads, bigger nodes can allow you to not have to distribute those shared resources. And so as a general rule of thumb, like bigger nodes are generally able to be bin packed more efficiently. But that's not the only constraint, right? There may be inode limitations. There may be file IO limitations. There may be like pod per node limitations. There may be networking limitations. So it's truly, helping users and teams think through all of those potential constraints to find that perfect balance of underlying infrastructure. And, there's a lot of things that are general to Kubernetes, but there's also, again, a lot of flexibility in how, Kubernetes can be run. So if you're tainting like assets in a certain way and doing something that's, like traffic splitting or something different than the very common use of Kubernetes, we'd work with teams to think through those. Typically, again, whether it's like in our community of open source users or with kind of like paid, Kubecost.
Is there a magic test inside of Kubecost to tell me that I should not be using Kubernetes at all, and I should just be using a container as a service, ECS, GCR, or whatever?
It's a great question. No magic tests yet, but we, while we are huge proponents of Kubernetes and think it brings so much power and just general benefits to most enterprises, we are also one of the first to say it's not right for everything. Would be open to input, but don't have a magic test within our product just yet. But we do have something to say, something as simple as like, if you're running in an environment where you have a cluster management, fee or overhead, and you're running a relatively small amount of workloads and you have multiple clusters, you may want to consider, re-architecting, whether it's, less Kubernetes environments or something that's more, serverless, to not be paying, a meaningful, part of your expenses in kind of overhead or, management fees.
We were talking earlier about moving from on-prem to cloud and then cloud to cloud. Have you had any of your clients or people out in the community go from cloud back to on-prem yet?
None that I am aware of that did a full transition and then back. From that perspective, it's in a lot of ways been a one-way transition, which I think that speaks, very positive to all the great, solutions that are available. I do think we've seen situations where whether it's compliance or regulation or even learning new things about, say behavior of applications where certain applications have been moved from one environment and then back, but never, can I think of an example where there was a full, transition to cloud and then back?
Going back to the beginning, you brought up 3 points of in-cluster, external, and then sharing. Those are my phrases. They may be the same as yours, or I don't remember. But once we get to the sharing, that's really multi-tenancy. And the other two could have implicit multi-tenancy as well. How do we really break down the multi-tenant costs? Is it tagging? Is it go deeper than that?
Yeah, great question. So the way, you laid it out well there, which is the way we think about it is in cluster and external costs, and then shared are is an overlaying bucket on top of that. So you could have, I picked the example of a kube system namespace or a monitoring namespace, for example, where, those are your Prometheus, your observability stack is shared across all tenants. So, see a number of ways that those are distributed, but I would say the most common are namespace, label, and annotation. And then I would say some either by controller or by service. And I would say that generally in Kubernetes land, given, the benefits and also ease of segmenting by namespace, for example, or, appending a label to a Helm chart, et cetera, that most teams are even doing that independent of costs, right? Let's say a team hasn't been thinking about costs. Oftentimes they're things are segmented or organized in a way that it's generally really easy to start once you have this, real-time visibility to start, thinking about things in a cohesive way. So that's on the in cluster side. The out of cluster side, I think the world is a little bit more, I'd say bifurcated or varied. There's a lot of teams that are still doing a lot of cloud tagging, for example. In Kubecost, you would have the ability to take that tag and then allocate it back to, again, a Kubernetes tenant or set of Kubernetes tenants. But then we also have some functionality in Kubecost, which is a network module where basically looking at network traffic across different, CIDR blocks to say different AWS services, you can actually use that traffic to estimate the relative proportion of cost of those shared resources. I think that gets it to how teams are doing it. Typically we see three patterns. One is just uniformly or evenly distributing shared costs. So taking that monitoring namespace and just like, evenly dividing it across like all 10 teams, let's say, in your environment. The other would be relative to your consumption of other resources. So if you're consuming 15% of total cluster costs, you should get 15% of the shared cluster costs. And then lastly would be some notion of like a custom metric where it's like, you're truly getting billed on like ingress and egress to some service or like number of API calls, for example. So those are like three common patterns for like really allocating those effectively.
And that last example on ingress, egress, that really maps back to all of the cloud providers because they charge per transaction. We're back to mainframe days to where you're charged. Just you make a request, you pay me money.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it touches on this like broader like open source effort to like really kind of drive some standardization here. A lot of services are built on, just like you said, kind of a per usage basis, whether it's, commonly like transactional from a network standpoint. But, there's a variety of services where sometimes there's a usage-based cost in addition to a reservation cost. I think a good example of that one may be a load balancer with certain cloud providers where, yes, you pay on like an hourly basis, but then you also pay like per forwarding rule or per like GB, transferred. So I think that's part of why it can be a little bit tricky is that, these models can differ some across providers. And that's where we've kind of turned to like, open source tooling to try to help give a layer of like standardization or abstraction on how to think about, concepts across different providers where like those billing models may slightly differ.
So as we're starting to wrap up today, we've talked about the costing through Kubernetes. I'm holding my breath probably till I'm purple for should I move to just a container as a service or not. I want that. I need to put in an RFE for that one. What else is going on from a Kubecost perspective?
Yeah, we've got a lot going on. We are, really excited to announce this new effort by the name of OpenCost, which is taking a lot of the kind of core Kubecost engine, a lot of which is open source today, but some of it isn't. We're moving that to this new effort by the name of Kubecost. With that, we're contributing, working with the other partners in the ecosystem to contribute a spec or a standard so that we can start having kind of a common language for just how to think about cost attribution and cost monitoring in this ecosystem. So going to be investing a lot more in the open source piece. And then we also have now hosted Kubecosts in limited availability. So like, a cloud managed version of Kubecost, which we'll be sharing more about soon. But you can reach out to our team if you're interested in learning more.
All of Webb's contact information is down in the show notes. Webb, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.